When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared over Europe, the Luftwaffe pilots sneered. They called it the flying milk jug, too heavy, too clumsy, too American to survive the brutal dance of aerial combat. To German aces who had torn apart Spitfires and Mustangs, this hulking metal beast looked more like a joke than a threat. But laughter has a short life on the battlefield. Because what the Luftwaffe didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the P-47 was not designed to dazzle. It was designed to endure, to dive into flak-filled skies, shrug off cannon fire, and climb back out with the fury of a thunderstorm. When the first Thunderbolts roared across the channel, their 50-caliber machine guns shredded Messerschmitts mid-turn. Their rugged armor returned home riddled with holes but still flying. And soon, the same Luftwaffe pilots who once laughed began to whisper, Der Teufel mit Flügeln, the devil with wings. This is the story of how a ridiculed brute of a fighter became the most feared destroyer in the European skies, how it changed the air war forever, and how the laughter of the Luftwaffe died, one burning wreck at a time. In the early days of World War II, when the skies over Europe burned with the fire of relentless aerial combat, America's newest fighter arrived not with fanfare, but with doubt. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked nothing like the elegant killers of the air that came before it. It was enormous, almost comically so. At over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. When it rolled out of its hangar for the first time, even its own pilots questioned if it could ever truly fight. Compared to the sleek, predatory silhouettes of the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Foch, Wolf 190, the Thunderbolt looked like an overweight brawler in a ring of dancers. Its massive radial engine made it appear blunt, its wings thick, its cockpit buried inside a metal fortress. The Luftwaffe pilots saw photographs and laughed. They mocked it as a milk jug, and believed it would be too slow, too heavy, and too cumbersome to compete in the deadly chaos of European airspace. But beneath its unflattering exterior lay a design philosophy unlike anything the world had seen. A weapon built not for grace but for survival, not for show but for sheer, brutal endurance. The American engineers who conceived the P-47 were not chasing elegance. They were building a fighter for a new kind of war, a war that demanded altitude, range, and power. They gave it the largest piston engine ever fitted to a single-seat fighter, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, capable of delivering over 2,000 horsepower. They encased the pilot in a bubble of armor and packed 50-caliber Browning machine guns into its wings, enough firepower to tear through enemy bombers or ground convoys in seconds. And they made sure it could dive faster than any other plane in the sky, using its massive weight to its advantage. What looked like a weakness became its greatest strength. When the first P-47s reached Britain in 1943, skepticism still hung in the air. The RAF and USAF pilots who received them were used to lighter, more agile aircraft, and many wondered how they would ever outmaneuver the Luftwaffe's best. But once they took to the skies, they discovered a truth that the Germans would soon fear. The Thunderbolt could take punishment like no other plane. It could be riddled with bullets, lose cylinders, oil pressure, or half a wing, and still claw its way home. The Luftwaffe's cannons, once lethal against Spitfires and Mustangs, often failed to bring down this flying fortress. As American squadrons grew accustomed to its weight and learned to fight with its speed in dives and its incredible durability, the P-47 began to transform from the butt of jokes into a legend of fear. The same German pilots who had mocked its size soon watched their comrades vanish in flames beneath its guns. What they had laughed at was not a clumsy brute. It was an indestructible hammer of war. Forged for a battle they did not yet understand, ChatGPT said. At the heart of the P-47 Thunderbolt's transformation from a lumbering giant to a sky-born predator was a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. This monstrous 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial power plant was the beating heart of the Thunderbolt, the source of its thunder, its speed, and its terrifying presence in the skies over Europe. Weighing more than a small car, it produced over 2,000 horsepower and could push the P-47 to speeds exceeding 40-30 miles per hour. Unheard of for an aircraft of its size and bulk. At a time when most fighters relied on liquid-cooled inline engines like those of the Spitfire and Messerschmitt, the R-2800 gave the Thunderbolt something different: raw, untamed survivability. Even when punctured, leaking, or battered by flak, it kept running. It didn't just propel the aircraft, it defined its entire character. Engineers had gambled on brute force over elegance. Instead of chasing nimbleness, they sought altitude and velocity. With its turbo supercharger system mounted behind the cockpit, connected by a labyrinth of ducts and pipes, the R-2800 could breathe thin air at altitudes where many German fighters began to suffocate. The Thunderbolt could climb above its enemies, dive at blistering speed, and use gravity as an ally. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to follow it in a dive found themselves helpless, their wings shuddering, their engines screaming, their aircraft tearing apart, while the P-47 plunged like a meteor and then roared back skyward. The engine's deep, resonant growl became a sound that soldiers on the ground learned to associate with destruction. What made the R-2800 truly remarkable wasn't just its power, but its reliability under hellish conditions. Pilots often returned to base with engines that had been shot, leaking oil and fuel, but still turning. Some flew hundreds of miles with dead cylinders, with fires smoldering under the cowling, and yet managed to land safely. It was an engine built for war, not exhibition. The mechanics who serviced it called it a masterpiece of American engineering, a power plant that refused to die, no matter how much punishment it took. It was this stubborn resilience that allowed the P-47 to become more than a fighter. It became an airborne tank. This engine gave the Thunderbolt range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and strength to dive into ground attack missions that shattered German convoys and rail lines. The roar of its double WASP cylinders became the anthem of Allied air power, echoing over occupied Europe. Luftwaffe ground crews began to dread that sound long before they even saw the aircraft that carried it. They knew that where that thunder rolled, destruction followed. The R-2800 didn't just lift the P-47, it gave it a soul, one defined by unstoppable force, brutal endurance, and a voice that told the world America had arrived in the skies to stay. When the P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat for the first time in 1943, few expected it to survive, let alone dominate. The Luftwaffe controlled the European sky with veterans hardened by years of aerial warfare, flying sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that had shredded the best the Allies could send. The early Thunderbolt pilots of the U.S. 4th and 56 fighter groups stepped into their cockpits with a mix of pride and uncertainty. The aircraft was new, enormous, and untested in real combat, but war is the ultimate proving ground, and the P-47's baptism came swiftly and violently. On its first sorties over France, the big American fighter met the Luftwaffe's elite head-on, and the results were nothing short of shocking. At high altitude, the German pilots spotted the bulky newcomers and swooped in with confidence. They expected an easy kill, the kind of victory that had fed their egos since 1940. But as they closed in, the Thunderbolts didn't turn and flee. Instead, they held steady. Then came the roar of 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashing nearly 100 rounds per second. Entire bursts of glowing tracers cut through the sky like ribbons of fire, and in moments, Luftwaffe planes disintegrated midair. The Germans had never faced such concentrated firepower from a single fighter. One burst from a P-47 could tear apart an enemy aircraft without even hitting a vital spot. The Thunderbolt's pilots quickly learned to dive into attacks, fire once, and watch their targets vanish in explosions of smoke and flame. The first confirmed kills shocked everyone, especially the Germans. Reports spread of P-47s returning home riddled with holes, oil leaking, engines coughing, yet still flying strong. The Luftwaffe's 20 cannon shells, deadly against Spitfires and Mustangs, barely crippled the Thunderbolt's armored frame. Pilots told stories of enemy fighters running out of ammunition trying to bring one down. The very traits that made the P-47 the butt of jokes, its weight, its size, its brute structure, had now turned it into a nightmare. Its heavy frame gave it unmatched stability in dives, its engine shrugged off punishment that would have killed any other aircraft, and its firepower made it lethal from any angle. American commanders took notice. The skepticism that had once surrounded the P-47 evaporated in the heat of its victories. Squadrons began to trust the aircraft's might, adopting more aggressive tactics. They learned to fight vertically, climb high, strike fast, and dive back to safety, using the Thunderbolt's superior altitude performance. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe patrols were reporting increasing losses to these Jug fighters, named affectionately for their Jug-like shape. The baptism of fire had turned into a trial of dominance. In just months, the aircraft mocked as a flying tank had proven itself a sky warrior. The laughter that once filled German hangars was replaced by caution and fear whenever radar screens showed the unmistakable approach of the Thunderbolt squadron. As 1943 turned into 1944. The P-47 Thunderbolt began to shift from an untested brute to a cornerstone of Allied air dominance. What started as a defensive escort fighter had evolved into a weapon that reshaped Allied air strategy across Europe. At first, the U.S. Army Air Forces deployed Thunderbolts to protect bombers during daylight raids, but they quickly discovered something the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated. The Thunderbolt could climb higher, dive faster, and strike harder than almost anything else in the sky. When combined with the Allied bombing campaigns over Germany, it became the hammer that shattered the Nazi Air Force's confidence and coordination. The P-47 gave the Allies something they had lacked since the beginning of the war: an aircraft capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and still taking the fight directly to the Luftwaffe. Allied commanders recognized that the Thunderbolt's durability made it ideal for aggressive tactics. Rather than wait for German interceptors to attack bomber formations, Thunderbolt squadrons began sweeping ahead of them, hunting the enemy in their own airspace. They dove on Luftwaffe formations with terrifying precision, using altitude and speed to their advantage. The German pilots, accustomed to fighting lighter and more agile planes, were forced into defensive dogfights against an opponent that could not be easily climbed or destroyed. For the first time, The Luftwaffe began losing not just aircraft but control of the skies. The numbers told the story. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of enemy fighters, transport planes, and even heavily defended bombers. Their ability to absorb damage and keep flying allowed Allied forces to maintain relentless pressure. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by losses on the Eastern Front, could not replace its experienced pilots fast enough. Every successful Thunderbolt sortie meant another dent in Germany's ability to defend its airspace. Pilots who once viewed the P-47 as slow and clumsy now spoke of it with awe, calling it monster that refused to die. As the Allied strategy evolved, so too did the Thunderbolt's role. It became the spearhead of aerial offensives, flying ahead of bombing raids to clear the way, diving down on enemy airfields to destroy aircraft before they could even take off. The Luftwaffe's once unshakable morale began to crack. German pilots who had once boasted of their superiority now feared the sight of the massive silhouette streaking through the clouds. The Thunderbolt's presence changed how the war was fought. Its power, range, and endurance forced the Luftwaffe into retreat. By the time D-Day approached, the Allied air forces had rewritten the playbook of aerial warfare. The P-47 wasn't just protecting bombers anymore, it was controlling the air. The turning tide of World War II in Europe was no longer a question of if the Allies could dominate the skies, but how fast the Thunderbolts could finish the job they had started when the P-47 Thunderbolt descended from the clouds. Its mission was no longer limited to duels with enemy fighters. It had become the terror of the ground below. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, they needed more than air superiority. They needed total destruction of the German war machine on the ground. Roads, railways, convoys, tanks, artillery, communication lines, everything that kept the Wehrmacht alive had to be shattered before D-Day. And it was the P-47, once mocked for its bulk, that would become the tool of annihilation. The same features that made it an unlikely dogfighter now made it perfect for ground attack. Its thick armor could withstand heavy flak, its 8.50 caliber guns could rip apart columns of vehicles, and its massive frame could carry bombs, rockets, and fuel tanks with ease. In the skies over occupied France, the Jug became a storm of thunder and steel. Thunderbolt pilots flew low, sometimes only a few hundred feet off the ground, strafing anything that moved. German soldiers learned to fear the distinct roar of the double Wasp engine long before they saw the aircraft itself. A single P-47 could unleash thousands of rounds of ammunition in a single pass, tearing through trucks, tanks, and infantry formations. Then, as if that weren't enough, it could release bombs or fire unguided rockets with terrifying accuracy. Entire convoys disappeared in seconds beneath the smoke and fire left in the Jug's wake. It wasn't elegant warfare, it was raw, merciless destruction, and it broke the German supply lines that once fed their armies. This new role was not born from strategy alone but from necessity. The Allies realized that to cripple the German war effort, they had to cut off its lifelines. The Thunderbolt became the executioner of that vision. It was rugged enough to fly multiple missions in a single day, sometimes returning home with shrapnel holes in its fuselage or oil streaked across the canopy, only to be patched and sent back out again. Mechanics on muddy airstrips worked day and night to keep them flying, and pilots began to take pride in their aircraft's indestructibility. It became a brotherhood of men and machine, a partnership forged in flame and grit. In Normandy, during and after D-Day, the Thunderbolts ruled the low skies. They obliterated German armor trying to reach the beaches, shredded trains attempting to resupply the front, and left trails of burning wreckage across northern France. The Germans nicknamed them Jabos, short for Jagbomber, fighter bombers that seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with impossible ferocity, and vanish back into the clouds. Their psychological effect was immense. Even seasoned German troops began to hesitate when they heard the distant rumble overhead. The Thunderbolt had transcended its origins as an escort fighter. It was now an instrument of fear, an angel of death that struck without warning, clearing the path for the liberation of Europe with the fury of thunder unleashed from above. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its reputation not just through firepower, but through its astonishing ability to survive the impossible. Pilots who flew it into the jaws of German defenses spoke of the aircraft as if it were alive, a companion that refused to let them die. The European skies were filled with invisible death flak bursts that could tear through wings, tracer rounds that stitched across the air like burning chains, and swarms of enemy fighters waiting to pounce. Yet, time and again, Thunderbolt pilots came home in planes that should have fallen from the sky. It was not uncommon to see a P-47 return with half a wing shredded, holes large enough to crawl through, and oil streaming from the engine, but still taxiing to the runway. Mechanics would shake their heads in disbelief, patch it up overnight, and send it back into battle the next morning. It was this durability that gave the Thunderbolt its mythic aura among the men who flew it and the enemies who tried to destroy it. German gunners cursed the Thunderbolt's name. Their flak shells that could rip apart lighter fighters like the Spitfire or Bf-109 often failed to bring down the heavy American machine. Even when the flak tore chunks from its wings, the P-47's radial engine kept roaring, its thick armor protecting the pilot from shrapnel and gunfire. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines of many aircraft, the air-cooled double Wasp could take hits to its cylinders and keep spinning. There were countless accounts of pilots flying back with oil pressure at zero, fuel leaking, instruments dead, and still making it home. One pilot returned to base with over 200 bullet holes in his fuselage. Another limped back across the channel on one cylinder after being struck by anti-aircraft fire. These stories spread quickly through Allied ranks and enemy camps alike, fueling the legend that the Thunderbolt simply could not be killed. In the skies, German aces discovered that engaging a Thunderbolt was a dangerous gamble. The P-47 could dive at speeds that no German plane could safely match. In a dive, its weight became a weapon. Its airframe stable, even when screaming toward the ground at over 500 miles per hour. Many Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to follow ended up tearing their wings apart. Others would score hits only to watch the Jug continue flying as if nothing had happened. One German ace reportedly said, "You don't shoot them down, you just make them angry." The P-47's survival wasn't only mechanical. It became psychological. Its pilots developed a fierce confidence, knowing that their aircraft could take them into hell and back. They pushed their limits, attacked with fearless aggression, and returned to base with stories that inspired entire squadrons. Each mission that ended with a battered Thunderbolt still flying reinforced its legend. It became more than a machine. It became a symbol of endurance. A living testament to the idea that sheer toughness could overcome any odds the enemy dared to throw at it. Be the end of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt had earned a place in history not through glamour or elegance, but through sheer, relentless dominance. What began as a misunderstood and mocked machine had become one of the most feared aircraft in the European theater. The Luftwaffe, once confident and unmatched, was now a shadow of its former self, worn down by attrition, exhaustion, and the constant roar of Thunderbolts overhead. The German pilots, who had laughed at the Jug's size, now watched helplessly as it obliterated their airfields, convoys, and supply lines. The laughter had turned into silence, then fear, and finally resignation. The P-47 was not just a fighter. It was a force of nature that symbolized the turning of the tide in the air war over Europe. Its legacy was written in numbers as much as in legend. The Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 sorties and destroyed nearly 7,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other U.S. fighter in the European campaign. But its true devastation came from the ground. The P-47 annihilated over 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, and countless tanks, trucks, and artillery positions. It didn't just win air battles, it crippled Germany's ability to fight. Its thunder echoed across every front line, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. Wherever the Allies advanced, the Thunderbolt was their guardian and avenger. Pilots who once doubted the aircraft became its fiercest defenders. They called it the Jug, with affection and awe. It wasn't sleek like the Mustang or graceful like the Spitfire, but it had something those planes didn't: indestructible will. The P-47 gave them confidence to take risks, to dive through flak clouds, to strafe enemy columns under fire, and to believe they could survive. Many credited the aircraft with saving their lives. The bond between man and machine grew so strong that some pilots requested to stay with their Thunderbolts, instead of transferring to newer aircraft. It was more than steel and rivets. It was a symbol of resilience, a partner in war that reflected the spirit of the men who flew it. For the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt represented a nightmare they could not wake from. Every time they tried to regroup, the Jug returned with thunder in its wings. It shattered the myth of German air superiority, proving that brute power, engineering, and unbreakable spirit could outlast even the most disciplined foes. When victory finally came, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies, and the P-47 had played a decisive role in claiming them. After the war, as the world rebuilt and newer jets took flight, the Thunderbolt's legacy remained untarnished. It stood as a testament to American innovation and courage. A machine born of doubt but forged into legend. The plane they mocked became the plane that broke their back, and its rumble through the clouds became the sound of victory itself.